Treaty because we want to get out from under the Indian Act and just want the generations coming up not to know what the Indian Act was. They will know what self-government is.
These kids are amazing.
Good morning, folks. Let's get started. Please be seated and put your cell phones away, please. Glad you can make it, Sam. Yesterday we talked about land and relationships to land. Today we're going to be talking about treaty. Anybody in the classroom knows what treaty means? More importantly, what treaty means to the Stalo people? Braden?
Aren't treaties something that will protect us from people taking our land?
Very good. That's a small part of it. Anybody else? Taylor?
My grandpa says that we'll get more land if we sign a treaty.
Very true. You both are correct. Before we get into the definition and explanation of what treaty is, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today. And we're very honored to have him here in our classroom. He is a former Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia. He is an honorable judge of British Columbia, and more importantly, a very proud member of the Stalo people. I'd like to introduce Grand Chief Stephen Point.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here to talk to you about this incredibly important issue. I think the important thing that we need to put into our minds and our hearts today is the fact that we're in a time of change. Things aren't going to be the same. And the question that we have to try to answer individually, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with the change and the fact that things are changing? So we're here to talk about treaties. I want you to talk to me about what's on your mind, okay? Because it's not about me anymore. It's really about you. You're the ones that are going to have to live with what we're doing today and your children. You have to get involved. Who wants to ask first? Go ahead.
Why do we have treaty negotiations?
Treaty negotiations began in British Columbia, early in the colonial period, when colonial governments began arriving in a new world. Aboriginal people were here. They had to deal with the fact that we were here, and the way that the British government dealt with it is by, first of all, entering into agreements with the Aboriginal people to purchase their land and then open the land up for settlement. That was done through treaty. And unfortunately, in British Columbia, after 14 treaties were negotiated on Vancouver Island, negotiations stopped. The British Columbia government, for a long time, denied that Aboriginal people even had any rights. And so the whole process simply got stalled. We often talk about Native rights or Aboriginal rights or claims, when in fact, it's the Europeans who come here and they're making claim to our country. And the treaty will benefit them as much as it will us by clarifying our relationship. That's why we're doing it.
What is Stalo territory?
Traditional territory, actually. When Europeans began coming here, of course, the Stalo people were living in their own defined territory. If you go to Yale, you'll still see the stone walls that they put in place just across from the township of Yale on the mountainside, where they used to fight the Inchkadmo people. We used to have tribal wars. They would try to come down and take our women, take our fish, even take our country. But we'd fight them, the Inchkadmo people. We fought to protect our territory, which ran from Yale all the way down to the ocean in the Fraser River. When they put the boundary through in 1846, they cut our nation and the Coast Salish people's nation in half. The Stalo people included, however, the Nuksak people. They were part of our people as well. So that's our territory before the Europeans came. These boundaries called BC, British Columbia, and Canada, the United States, they're all foreign to us. Our boundaries are different. we have our own territory. That's what we call soft our land.
Why do we need land if we already have reserves?
That's a good question, which is confusing to a lot of people. We have our reserves, right? We have Schuylkill Reserve, Chiacton Reserve, Yaquis Reserve. In truth, these reserves only represent a very, very small fraction of our entire traditional territory, which is some 55,000 square miles of territory. Reserves that were set aside and given to us out of our own territory, right, was supposed to be partly in compensation for the loss of the entire territory. But the government in Victoria ran out of money. They couldn't afford to buy the land from the Indians anymore. So they simply stopped buying the land, the general territory, from the Indians. And so what happened when they came to Stolonation, the Fraser Valley here, the government just began to put the Indians on the reserves, ignoring the larger question of having to buy the land from us to begin with. So that's the question that's still outstanding. That's why the leadership says it's still our country. We never got sold to them. We never lost it in a war. Whose land is it? Well, it's still ours then. So the government began to take on this role as they put Indians onto reserves as their father, their parent. They're going to be looking after us because they took us from our traditional territory. They put us on small reserves. They had to look after us then. And this obligation to take care of Indians has created what we call the wardship problem, where Indians still feel that the government has to look after us. Part of the answer, or part of the question that has to be resolved in the treaty process is, shouldn't our reserves be bigger? Shouldn't we have larger reserves? The answer is yes. The other question is, who should control the land? Should it still be controlled by the government, by the Indian Affairs, because they need to look after us because we're not capable of taking care of ourselves? No, the leadership says we're ready to take care of ourselves now. We don't want the government telling us what to do anymore. We want to be able to make up our own mind about our future. And so part of the treaty negotiations is about that issue. Our ability to increase our size of the reserves, but also to begin to take care of ourselves, to end this wardship relationship that began when Europeans first came, because they thought that we were incapable of taking care of ourselves.
Question, yes.
The land outside our reserves belongs to us, so why has it taken so long to deal with this?
Well, that's a good question. I know that a lot of people ask that in terms of the difference between the on-reserve and the off-reserve land.
One of the reasons it's simply taken so long is that the government hasn't agreed with us that we own the land. The federal government passed a law in around 1921 that said this: the Indians could no longer, by law, fight for their own rights. They couldn't hire even a lawyer. And if a lawyer was found working for the Indians, that lawyer could be disbarred. They didn't allow the Indians in their own country to try to fight for their rights. That's the other reason it's taken so long. And a lot of our own Canadians don't understand that this is what their own governments have done to us. And the other reason I think that it's taken so long is that Aboriginal people, even though we understood it was our country, we've been the poorest of this country. We've been living on our reserves, going through the residential school system, coming through a lot of problems like alcohol abuse. We've been kind of sleeping too, like disorientated, not knowing what to do. Some of our leaders knew, some of our leaders understood years and years ago. But a lot of our people are just now waking up. Your generation is waking up to the reality that this question is still outstanding and needs to be addressed. And that's why we're here, I hope, for you to understand that we're passing the gauntlet to you, the torch to you, to pick it up, to fight for what we know is right.
Don't we already have Aboriginal rights?
Yes, we do. Good question. Aboriginal rights don't rise simply because we have a treaty. The truth is, we've always had these Aboriginal rights because we believe the Creator put us in this part of the world. And those Aboriginal rights have never been extinguished, have never been taken away. The treaty simply recognizes them. And when we get them recognized in the treaty, they'll get protection from our Canadian Constitution, Section 35. Why is that important? Because once it's protected by the Constitution, the Canadian government can't amend it. They have a hard time amending their own Constitution. So the best place to protect our rights is in a place that is like stone, and that is the Canadian Constitution.
What do we lose with the treaty?
What do we lose with the treaty? Wow. There's so many fears people have, right? As I said at the beginning, we're in time of change. Things are going to change. As we've come from a time when we used to be independent and taking care of ourselves, fighting for our territory before Europeans arrived, we came to a time when the government has been looking after us under the Indian Act. That's this wardship time. What's going to change is that we're going to not be under the Indian Act so much for our protection or for taking care of ourselves. We're going to be under the roof of the treaty now. That means that we're going to look after ourselves. So we do lose, I would say, this wardship relationship with the federal government, which to me has been like a chain, right? We're going to unlock our chains and leave them behind and begin to look after ourselves. That's a change. A lot of people feel, oh, we get this tax protection from the reserves, so we don't have to pay tax on gasoline. That's true, we're going to lose that. We're going to have to start paying tax for our gasoline. But you should know that whenever countries like Canada pay for healthcare, education, roads, they pay for that partly through the development and collection of taxes. How is our government under the treaty going to pay for education, for roads, for your healthcare through taxation? We're going to contribute to that. Those of us who've got a job, those of us who buy cars and gasoline, we're going to put money in the bank for our own future generations. So we do lose that tax shelter, but what we're gaining is the right to contribute to our own children in our own way. I think we'll be in a better position, however, under the treaty, because we're going to have larger reserves, and our Aboriginal rights under the treaty will be protected so that we still have hunting and fishing access to areas outside of our reserves. I believe it's an improved situation. Even though things are changing, some people call that losses. I simply call it transformation. We're moving back into some time where we're now looking after ourselves again like it was before the Europeans arrived.
Where are we at in treaty?
We're about halfway through the process, the entire process. There's 6 stages.
Stage 4, which is an agreement in principle.
Was where we're at right now. Doing the hard work of identifying where our territories are, what lands we want to get back, how we want to be structured politically instead of being Indian bands. Are we going to be living under the Indian Act? No. We're going to be living under our own form of government. And how is that going to look like? Some of us have been working on structuring a constitution that will help us move into the era of self-governing body as a government within Canada. The treaty, in my view, is still the best way of protecting our rights.
All right, folks, let's give a round of applause for Mr. Stephen Point.
Thank you very much. These questions I hope have helped you to understand what treaties are about, and every time I talk about it, it helps me. Thank you very much.
Great presentation, very informative, heartfelt, and I hope most of you people understood what was going on here today. Sam, did you understand what was going on here today?
Yes.
Okay. Because we'll have 1 week to prepare our presentations on treaty, and the treaty topic is why Stalo would like to have treaty. Remember, folks, we have 1 week to complete this. 1 week, please.
Okay, so now you guys know what to do. If you have any questions, my assistant Brandy is outside, but I have a meeting to go to, so have fun.
Thank you. Okay, I think we should each have a role when we get up to do the presentation. So what I was thinking is we should pick 4 main questions on treaty and answer them the best way we can. What do y'all think?
Yeah, so let's come up with what is most important about treaty. I did like that guy's speech because I didn't even know what treaty was or why we should even care.
I really don't even know why we're going to bother. My grandma said she's been fighting for our land since she was young, and she's ancient. So we probably won't even see a treaty signed in our lifetime.
Maybe that can be something we research. How long have we been in treaty, and why is it taking so long?
Yes, so we can start the presentation with Sam, maybe just saying something like that. Maybe our whole presentation can be kind of negative questions and then find the positive answers.
You mean like, why do we even need treaty? Things are fine the way they are. I mean, I've heard people say we have enough, so quit whining already.
Hey, take a look at this.
Enter the treaty process. Today, approximately half of First Nations in BC are participating. There are 6 stages in the treaty process. Stage 1 is the submission of a statement of intent, requiring First Nations to identify their traditional territory. Stage 2 is a meeting between the 3 parties to determine whether they are ready to proceed with negotiation. Stage 3 is the negotiation of a framework agreement, a kind of table of contents for the treaty. These first 3 stages are mostly administrative. The longest stage is Stage 4. This is where all 3 parties try to reach an agreement in principle, or AIP. The governments of BC and Canada will make an offer of land and cash, which forms the basis for the treaty settlement package. However, it is important to note that when an AIP is reached, it is not yet legal. It still needs to be finalized.
It's actually close to 4 minutes long, but I did like that part at the end when it tells us about treaties and stuff. Now I understand what Grand Chief Stephen Pun was talking about when he said we were in stage 4 of the treaty negotiations.
Maybe we can use part of that in our presentation. We can ask Joy. Okay, here's some of the ideas and you'll tell me what you think. What is treaty and why are we in treaty? And Sam can say, why do we need treaty? Things seem fine the way they are. Anyways, we can come up with negative questions after we figure out the positive.
Yeah, and we could find out if we ever did get into a treaty, what that would mean for us. You know, like what will we get or what will we lose?
I just wonder, would we run our bands the same way? Or would we have like a president or vice president?
What are you, American? We have prime ministers and premiers here. Hello.
We know what call-in means. Grand Chief Stephen mentioned self-govern, so we should figure out what that means and figure out what it would be like if we did govern ourselves.
We do need to find out more about the history, like a really short definition of the Indian Act. And maybe we could have one of our parents come down and read that promise, you know.
The Crown's Promise. Actually, my mom has this little camcorder I could use. Maybe we could set something up in the woods and have some older white person read it. I bet your dad looks white, Sam. Or we could even go down by the river.
Remember the chief mentioned the team that is working on the treaty? Maybe we can go up to my parents' fishing site and interview them with your mom's camcorder. I mean, obviously I've been working on this for a long time, so they would have a lot of answers.
Yeah, so our presentation could start off with us having a conversation about treaty, going from history to now. Maybe the opening shot can be, Sam's dad. Okay, fine, or someone who's not First Nations, telling the Crown's Promise speech. Then it come back to us and we could talk about the Indian Act. Sam can make her negative comments. No need to memorize, hey Sam.
Whatever.
Can you just stop, Taylor, please? Okay, we need a few things from the library because I think we're going to get the boot soon. Colin, isn't there a few books written by your own people that might have maps and pictures of our territory?
Here it is. My uncle helped with the Stalo Atlas, and you were asked to witness. They probably have lots of information.
Okay, this is what we should do. Colin and Taylor, you two can try and track down maps and pictures we might need. Sam and I will get the names of the team that knows treaty.
They are called the Treaty Negotiation Team. Actually, my uncle is on the team, Sonny McKelsey. I can call him if you like.
Okay, yeah, then Taylor, why don't you ask Mr. Servatius to get the other names and contacts if he has them and get your mom's camcorder. And maybe you can find someone to read the Crown's...
Promise.
Sam, you and I can get the questions together for the Yale shoot, and I'll see if we can go out to my parents' fishing site.
Okay, great job, group number 2. Well done. Our next group, group number 3, known as SXTA. Please come on up, group number 3.
Hi, my grandparents always told me to welcome any special guest before making a speech, so I would like to put my hands up to you, Grand Chief Stephen Point, and welcome you to our classroom. We have decided to start a presentation with a reenactment on how we started to study. From the kind help from Taylor's mom, we have made a video on treaty negotiating Team TNT.
Can't believe we didn't think of that.
I like the way that guy gave his speech. Sorry, I mean you. I'm just really terrible with names. Well, I kind of understand Treaty a bit more after what he said.
Treaty. My grandma said she's been fighting for our land since she was young, and she's ancient. Why should we care? It's our parents' problem. I've heard people say we have enough, so quit whining already.
How many of us have heard this or felt angered by this statement? This is one of the best reasons why we need to understand the importance of treaty and why we should still continue the fight. By the time it comes to voting on treaty, our generation will be right alongside with our parents voting. So it's not just our parents' problem, because this treaty is going to affect us, our children, their children, for 7 generations to come. And the SXTA is looking for 100 years ahead.
If we don't go with treaty, then what?
Just stay under the Indian Act. I mean, it must be a good law. They made it for a reason, so we should just stick with it.
The Indian Act was written to control First Nations peoples. It was established in 1876, and it defines who a First Nations person is and holds certain legal restrictions and legal rights for registered Indians. It was made by the Canadian government and not First Nations people. The Act is not here to protect our basic rights, it just tells us how to live. Because the government is in complete control of what happens in Canada, and it can change the Act without discussing anything with the Indians.
Did you know the Queen made a promise back in 1864 to our people, but never kept it?
See, ancient history. We should just keep going the way we're going. We're doing just fine.
The promise was known as the Crown's Promise in 1864 in New Westminster, and just the thought of letting things go the way they are would probably be the biggest mistake we have ever made. We will help show our negative Nelly why treaty is important. Okay, Colin, roll the film and Taylor, hit the lights.
Why is the treaty taking so long?
It's been 21 years now that the negotiations have been going on. Been a huge process of learning about Stalo rights and title, about the history of the relations of Stalo people and the newcomers here, the Huilitum, and really understanding what the negotiations are about. So they're about reconciling that relationship between Stalo, the Stalo Huilmuk members, the First Nations of the Stalo Huilmuk Treaty Association, and their rights and title in that relationship with the government, both Canada and British Columbia. So it's complicated, and all of the aspects of the negotiation were laid out, and there's 28 issues, and many of them are very, very large issues. Working through them requires going back and forth, requires a lot of work, and it requires going back and forth with the community to get input, to figure out what the views are, just to figure out and get the input to the negotiating team, what we should say, what is it we're talking to the government about on behalf of the community. We're the community's spokespeople.
Every time the province has an election or the federal government has an election, we always have to hold back for a few months and then let the new government catch up. So there are many other First Nations that are negotiating, And it seems like there's a limited amount of funding that the BC Treaty Commission has, and that has to be kind of allocated kind of fairly and evenly across. So.
Isn't the treaty going to cost a lot and put us into debt? Like, how will we pay it back?
Part of the process is borrowing money to do this work. It requires capacity. It requires funding to support and build that capacity, to have negotiators, to have the team, to have all the workers, to support the involvement of the communities and the political leadership. And that money is not there at the moment, so it's something that is laid out. We can borrow most of that. There's the 80% borrowed and 20% granted to us to do the work. What happens is, in a successful treaty, that gets built in. It gets figured out or laid out as a way of repaying it, or gets absorbed in the treaty in various ways. So we don't see that as an issue. Ultimately, it's a necessary thing. It's not in the big picture. It's not a substantial amount of money, but it's a necessary amount of money that supports the work we're doing. Really, without that, we couldn't do the work. And it's our goal to use that wisely and use it as effectively as we possibly can to the best result for the community for whom we're working, and that's for yourselves. So it takes time, it takes money. Those two go hand in hand, and they combine to give us a basis to conclude this effectively.
Will our communities have more land and housing?
Definitely, our communities will have more land and more places for housing. That's what we're looking for, is to secure more land, and then of course we'll have different ways of using the land, and one of those important ways is will be housing.
Under the treaty, we're negotiating all aspects of community life, and essentially the most important things is that we're seeking jurisdiction and control over our lives. Along with that, an increased land base to allow us to develop the amenities and provide the services that are necessary for our communities to thrive. Essentially, through that and through a treaty, we'll be able to get all of these things protected under the Constitution of Canada. In essence, it'll allow us to generate our own revenues and develop our own programs that are better suited for our people.
Who's in charge of health and education right now? Right? Funding flows through to the Stalo communities, and oftentimes not directly to the Stalo First Nations, to provide services and programs that are based in education and health and other areas, social services and so on. It's a matter of the funding, but more importantly, it's a matter of the lawmaking powers and the governance. Stalo right now don't have direct governance over any of those fields, right? And we currently work with the governments in providing services that they delegate to us. And along with that delegation of our roles, of our responsibilities to provide those services to the community, comes the funding to support that. So it's kind of like secondhand funding, it's secondhand authority. What we're trying to achieve is firsthand, direct lawmaking powers. You move the governments to the side and you take that space. You stand there as the government that takes care of the people directly, provides those kinds of programs and services. And the funding will continue to flow through the governments to the Stalo Treaty Group, in addition to whatever other funds can be raised to support those programs and services. But it's in your hands to be, it will be in your hands to be self-governing and self-sufficient, and provide those services directly through your government to your people.
Okay, everyone ready?
Yeah, got it. Okay.
And action.
We could go to court. You're quite right. We could go to court, but the problem with that is we would go to court, and the only thing we'd get out of the court is the land would be settled. So you'd get a court declaration of your land, which is what Chilcotin got, but you still wouldn't have self-government, because you're never going to get a court declaration for all of self-government. You still got to sit down and negotiate that. So as far as I'm concerned, you can spend 20 years going to court and get just the land, and then another 20 years negotiating self-government, or you can do 20 years doing both. And then the second part of this is that if you negotiate an agreement, then the part of the negotiation in a treaty is that it gets protected by the highest law in our country, which is the Constitution Act. And that's worth everything. And the court declaration doesn't get you that.
One of the big things that we've been working on for a good long time now, 10 years or so, with a lot of community input, is exactly what do you want your government to be? What do you want it to look like? How many representatives do you want to have? The way that's laid out as a nation, a Stalo nation, that's what will come into effect and replace the current chiefs and councils. It'll be your own system instead of the system set out by the federal government right now.
I have great faith that you can run your own government. I know some people think that worried about it, right? Will you make mistakes? Absolutely. You know, every government does, right? You will make mistakes, but you'll learn from them. But the good thing about it is your government now, instead of being accountable to somebody in Ottawa, is going to be accountable to your people on the ground. And if you don't like what they're doing, you vote them out and they will change it.
Sever the ties to the Indian Act. And by doing that, create a new space for your government, for self-government to be developed and to be put into place, to be self-sufficient, to have a direct role in the lawmaking and provision of services to your own people, to the Stalo people in treaty, and the caretaking over the lands.
Right now, they can't really change anything. So you will have your own government, and I think you're ready for it. I think you were ready for it 100. I don't think it actually should ever have been taken away from you in the first place. But are you ready for it? Absolutely. Can you do it? Absolutely. Should you be doing it? Absolutely. And it will happen. On midnight, on effective date of the treaty, 1201, you are self-governing. Different people. I look forward to a generation of Stalo kids who are just Stalo kids and not Indian Act kids, right? They'll be different. They'll be different. They'll grow up with a different attitude about life and about who they are and what they can be. And that is worth everything.
Are we giving up our Aboriginal rights and title by going into treaty?
No, we are not giving up our Aboriginal rights and title. We have to maintain our Aboriginal rights and title based on a principle that was shared with us by the late Tilly Gutierrez from Chowsel back in 1988. She reminded us that as a young girl, she remembered hearing the chiefs when they got together for a meeting up at Eam. When they started their meeting to talk about the land question, they started off with this important statement. And meaning this is our land, we have to take care of everything that belongs to us. So that principle remains to be a strong principle for us, and as we continue on with our negotiations, that's the principle that we abide by.
Great job, well done. We would have more time for presentations, but that's going to be at a later date. I would like to bring up Chief Stephen Point on the final word for the day.
I really want to thank you once again for having me in your class, and I was very impressed by the video and the presentation. I'd like to ask for a copy of that. And my final word is just this, that the best way we can protect ourselves against the erosion of our Aboriginal rights is through a treaty. Thank you.
We're in treaty because we want to get out of the Indian Act and we want to be self-governing.
Why am I in treaty? I want to get some of my land back.
I am the third chief to sit at this SXTA table. My grandfather, Chief Johnny George, was the first member, and I'm following his passion because I believe that he was taking care of my family to not live underneath the Indian Act.
We are in treaty because we are thinking of the future and adding to the existing land and resources we currently own.
And we're in treaty because we want to get out from under the Indian Act. A process that many of our community members, all of our community members, have been born into. And the challenges in reshaping the thinking around the Indian Act is going to be probably one of our biggest hurdles.
They went to Ottawa for the land question. That's where it was started.
And so we're just trying to follow their footprints and continue it on.
A lot of work has been done to do comparisons with respect to non-treaty versus treaty, and forecasting has been done in that regard, and here are some of the outcomes of that analysis. Regarding population, it's for non-treaty communities, it's increasing. For treaty communities, it's also increasing. Land base, right now the non-treaty will be having to make do with their existing reserves. Under treaty, there'll be a substantial increase in the size of the reserves. It's authority. The non-treaties will continue to live under the Indian Act. Treaty communities will have self-governance and lawmaking powers. Funding services under non-treaty, it'll continue to be through the federal government, and as we all know, it's declining. Under treaty, there'll be multiple sources of funding, which will be increasing and expanding. Under Aboriginal rights, the non-treaty communities still are under the Section 35, and which are undefined. The treaty communities will have Section 35 rights that will be defined and unextinguished. Also, new findings show a 17% increase in the health and well-being among communities with modern treaties.